Oh, wow. Now, this is a cold open. Welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm McCosk.
I'm Iron. And Bronze.
Yeah,
Bronze?
I'm here. This is me, Bronze. There was an issue with the audio. Sorry.
No harm, no harm. We've done worse startups than this. In any case, to our good listeners, today is the mythical China episode, where we will talk about what amounts to 3,000 years of continuous history in a 1 hour episode. God help us all.
Or less.
I hope we have a mandate.
Yeah, a mandate from heaven. So, I mean, I think the place to begin really, obviously, is going to be in the formation of China as a political body, because obviously anyone with any kind of knowledge of Chinese ethnography will realize that what we now sort of call the Han or whatever, who constitute, I believe, 95% of the population, emerged from a variety of polities, city-states, and various ethnic groups congealing in the North China plain, basically.
Indeed. To move along this, in fact, the name Han only became the title for the people because of the famous Han dynasty, which was the second imperial dynasty in Chinese history, after the hilarious collapse of the Qin.
When you say hilarious, why do you say that? I mean, I haven't heard too much about
It's
that.
very simple. When To all monarchists who listen to this show, you ever wonder where the often Republicans we have to bear with come with their absurd ideas as to what a monarchy is, to why in God's name would any monarch in their right mind do the absurd tyrannical stuff you claim they do, and like you just scratch your head, where did they get this? They 95% of the time get it from a bastardization of what the Qin dynasty did. Let me explain to you what the Qin dynasty did. The Qin dynasty only had one emperor, and he was so brutal that shit talking him to oblivion was a pastime of Confucian scholars for 3,000 years straight. He famously burned books and buried scholars alive, had what amounts to a law system so draconian and so authoritarian that, frankly, North Korea would be considered democratic and a bastion of human rights by comparison. It was the ultimate legalist state, legalist as in the philosophy of China, and it was just a surreal exercise in bizarro authoritarianism verging on totalitarianism that only the East has been able to provide to us to this day.
I mean, the tyranny was cartoonish in its proportions.
Yes, the Qin dynasty, which came to be after the fall of China's longest non-imperial dynasty and longest dynasty period. The Let me see, yeah, the
The Zhou.
Zhou dynasty, yeah, a glorious 700 years if memory serves. Yeah,
Yeah, roughly.
The Qin dynasty came to power at the end of the Warring States period. Note, there were many quote unquote warring states collapse, the central authority collapse, and the country just goes to hell basically multiple times throughout Chinese history. The Warring States period was the first. Well, technically, the Spring and Autumn came before, but that's a different topic. But that said, although absurdly comedic in its tyranny, the Qin dynasty was probably amongst the most influential in that it created the idea of China, of the Middle Kingdom. It essentially established what would be almost in an unadulterated form for 600 to perhaps like 1,000 if you're generous in terms of unadulterateness, the baseline Chinese imperial administration policy and organization. And even after that, in a very newly influenced and altered form by various other angles, the blueprint of basically Chinese imperial administration comes back to the Qin dynasty to a T.
I mean, the word China itself is derived from the word Qin for Qin
Well,
dynasty.
depending on your language, for some people it's derived from Cathay, which comes from the Khitans.
Yeah, okay, but we didn't have time. Nuance aside, the word
Yes,
China comes from Qin.
yes. In English, it does indeed, in fact, come from Qin.
And this is an English-speaking podcast. And don't you forget it.
Ouch! I feel
I'm
oppressed.
Dowser. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean that's remember to dab on the foreigners, but first and foremost, Brexit means Brexit. Fuck off Scotland. The secondarily, I think there is this point basically that if you sort of, as you point out, if you compare like Qin versus Xiao that comes before, the emergence of like the Proto Han or whatever does take place within the essentially the context of spreading up of Mandarin or what is now called Putonghao, so the main Chinese language, and the sort of basic and I think the interesting question here, which is one that I often like to think about, is why did the Western Roman Empire fall, or sorry, the Roman Empire collapse in the way that it did, compared to China, which I mean, it's China has, yeah. Why has China been able to maintain this kind of fairly unified structure that the Roman Empire, which existed at a similar period of time as, especially the Qin, it didn't, and the basic reason, as far as I can tell, is this is just the geography, and I think the geography is one of the important things to realize about the turnover of Chinese dynasties. In that, if you basically control this sort of north North China plain between I think it's the Yellow River and the Brown River, or sort of the river up, so between Beijing and Shanghai, essentially, if you control
Yeah,
that
I mean,
region.
the delta of the Yellow River is a region that's very sort of important because it's very advantageous to farming, especially to the humidity-heavy farming that is required to grow rice. And so it's important for controlling China.
Yeah,
Another important thing is that those rivers function as both natural borders and natural lines of transport. Remember, the biggest naval battle in human history was fought in a lake in China.
when you say biggest, was that like in terms of population
Raw,
or tonnage?
raw ship numbers.
Oh wow, okay. I mean, probably not tonnage, but that
It's
sounds interesting.
Chinese history is wild in ways the West does not often comprehend.
I mean, rice and the sort of cultivation of rivers is incredibly important to Chinese history in the sense that the first advanced societies in China start revolving around rice, and specifically under Yu the engineer, who sort of advanced, or rather, the semi-mythical figure of Yu the engineer that advances rice production. Because of course, before that, the Chinese had a millet-based diet, same as they had in Bronze Age Europe, which made it very difficult to create advanced societies.
Well, yeah, because I mean, rice is sort of equivalent to potatoes in terms of ease of production and nutrition. And that is the big reason why you get these sort of stupidly high numbers of these stupidly high numbers like Chinese population, and why like you are able to have pitched battles with almost 1 million combatants under the Ming,
Well,
which
but to be fair, to point out the absurd numbers of China really are comparatively recent in that they only harken back to the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty, which was due to its. Let me put it like this: the Qing are often maligned because their ending was very pathetic and humiliating. But in absolute raw numbers, they were probably the most soul-crushingly successful dynasty, to the point that that in absolute terms, what killed them was their own demography, basically.
what the sort of complete swallowing up of the of the oh fuck, I can't remember the name now. The ruling ethnicity.
Yeah, the it's a bit more complicated than that, but essentially you get especially if you read some of the accounts, well, obviously translated, so air quotes and everything I say, I suppose. The base idea was that the average Chinese farmer under the Qing, especially coming the nearing the terminus of the dynasty, was forced into incredibly smaller and smaller fields, and there was such a population issue that the wicker palisade that historically separates Manchuria, well, historically is perhaps such too strong a word, but in any case, that separated ideologically Manchuria from the rest of China was quote unquote ignored, and that allowed for the complete and utter ethnical makeover of the northern province of the three northeastern provinces, because calling them Manchuria is a slur. Oh wow, I just slurred in the podcast. In any case,
Wow, my God, that is really setting the low. I'm gonna have to edit that out now.
Christ. In any case, yeah, it was during this period, though technically it only reached its final part under Chinese administration with their whole five races thing. But it was under the Qing that the Manchus became an ultra minority, even in their own homeland. So bad it was the demographic pressure.
And because it's the only part of Chinese history that my economic degree has prepared me to talk about, I'm going to talk more about rice, because during the late Qing period, there was a lot of advances in the rice paddy system, specifically that allowed them to have 2 harvests a year, which was sort of completely revolutionary and created such a surplus of food that the population skyrocketed.
The Qing
Part
dynasty.
of the innovation of that was because they found out that if you let fish swim and defecate in your rice field, then you're going to have more rice.
Lovely.
Wow, just a mental image.
Yeah, I mean it's fertilizer that manages itself.
I suppose it
Probably
is.
Probably also ate parasites, was because I would think that the because I believe carp are eaten meat.
Yeah, I think it was carp.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be carp, but no, I mean, that is also quite interesting then, because that actually in many ways parallels then what happened in Ireland. That in Ireland there was this sort of massive population explosion, which, coupled with sort of the weird laws, meant that the meant that you had about 8 million people in sort of weird inheritance systems, such that you were getting people forced onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. And obviously this culminates in the Irish potato famine, and the Irish population has never recovered since. So it's interesting to me that the late Qing, as far as you're describing, almost experienced a similar thing as what happened in Ireland, that the sort of method of production, agricultural production, coupled with just like a population explosion, meant that they were like sort of forced, caused social unrest essentially, and ultimately I think in China it was like an explosion of bandits first and foremost, as far as I know, that
Yes,
laid the groundwork.
an explosion of bandits, an explosion of religious secret societies, discontent at Qing dynasty's inability to really oppose the West and the generalized and like the Qing dynasty for all of its history was never quite popular. Like you had, how am I going to put this? The Qing dynasty, even when it fell, only really had loyalists in the north, basically. And in I cannot in the part of China whose name I cannot say. In the south, the closest thing to have any kind of monarchist sympathies you had, and I shit you not, you had people who wanted the descendant of Confucius to be the new emperor, or you had straight up Ming loyalists who wanted to like, let's go Qing again here 1926 during the during the peak of the high warlord era. The
Epic.
the Qing were never a like not only, I mean, in many ways, the Qing are like the Qajars. They were a dynasty that tried its best, but got dealt an absurdly bad hand at their end, and especially by history. Although I've been told that there have been some attempts at rehabilitating the Qing, at least the early Qing, which makes sense because the Qing are literally the dynasty responsible for China's current borders. The but we went from the first dynasty to the last dynasty in a single jump.
I mean, well, so I think if we want to understand Chinese monarchism, we do have to understand where it began and where it ended. And I think obviously there is a very large interperiod, but I think one of the interesting points that is raised by this transition is the fact that the last monarchy was ethnically not Chinese, and there is this big point that like many of what is China, what is sort of in China is not just sort of, extra regions like, Korea or Vietnam, has in large part been defined by these foreign ethnic groups taking over and sort of incorporating their bit, be that the Yaon, be that the Qing, obviously, or even sort of Jurchens or something, or not Jurchens, like prior ethnic groups.
The Khitan, the Proto-Mongols, the Turkic northern dynasties. When we get to the Turkish monarchism episode, we are going to be here for a while talking about all the dynasties that they spawned, because by God did they spawn many. But
Yeah, I mean that is a whole situation.
it it is truly the Turkish shtick. In any case, going back to the topic of China and, well, China proper, I suppose, is that Chinese monarchism can be easily summed up in three things. A, its unique nature of the mandate of heaven, and the fact that the mandate of heaven is actually revocable by the heavens. The extreme importance in ritual, and the extreme importance in bureaucracy. This even goes back to the Qin dynasty, the Qin dynasty. Sorry, Q's are pronounced ch for some reason. The base idea is that these are the three pillars of what Chinese monarchism was for its longest for the longest time.
I think it's important to stress just how long the continuity of this system is. The dynastic rule of China, which is, while varied, it has many continuities throughout it for thousands of years.
Yeah,
in a way that I think is sort of without parallel.
It is it has no equal, because one of the best ways to achieve legitimacy was to emulate but improve upon the previous dynasty you overthrow. So you had often a continuation of offices, you had often a continuation of base laws, have often a continuation of army organization, though to be fair, in China's case, army organization and navy organization, especially navy, was never particularly a strong strength of theirs.
Well, it was until a point when they scuttled the entire fleet in the middle of the 15th century.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, what were they going to use it for? Like, other than sort of kicking out Japanese pirates from Korean islands, like, you know, who's going to be your enemy? Because I mean, this
the
is
British.
but I mean, you are Mr. Mongol emperor. How are you going to know the British are going to come along sort of 600 years later and be like,
The
buy
Mongols,
our drugs?
the Mongols were already out of China by that point, but fine.
Oh, well, I mean, there's no real difference between Manchus and Mongols, so that doesn't really matter there. But
Can you stop slurring on this very fine podcast?
I like sort of in the first 10 minutes or so, I said like I slurred all the Scottish. So I feel like
They don't. We're not very worried about them. I mean, the Manchu
well,
viewership of this podcast is
I feel like there's going to be more Scots than there's gonna be
invaluable.
This is true. This is very true.
I
But
mean, our social credit score is all it. We're in the danger zone. Okay,
this is probably true.
I don't want to talk to because you know he's gonna look. Just try to not say it. Okay.
I will try not to. But yeah. So the point is, I think people malign unfairly the decision to kind of turn inwards by these various Chinese groups, but it seems to me that especially under the Ming, like the Ming had a lot of internal issues, so their decision to focus on China itself to me seems to be a fairly logical decision, especially if you consider the fact that like China in that period, like China even now is very hard to run, and it's a one-party state. Like it's sort of like there's not much room for internal maneuver by localities under the Ming and the Qing and the
Going
Yao.
and going back way back to the Qing, there was one dynasty that did not consider postings outside of the court to be insults, but literally every single other dynasty considered to be, if you were posted somewhere outside of the imperial court, that was an insult, a clear mark that you had lost favor with the emperor, and pretty much a, well, I'm already fucked, so why not revolt kind of situation. So talented administration in the periphery was intensely hard to come by at all periods.
Well, yeah, like why would you, Mr. Noble from, I don't know, sort of Nanjing or Beijing, why would you want to go oversee some yokels in like Wuhan or other plague-stricken regions? Like it's sort of much better to be in the main cities, sort of where all the action's at.
Where all the brothels are. That's what the
Also,
Chinese.
I think the Yongle Emperor gets a lot of criticism for scuttling the navy and dismissing Zheng Ha. But I mean, if he didn't have a crystal ball, I don't think that he could have known that the navy thing is going to be more important than ever, and that some plucky people from a rainy island are going to own a fourth of the globe, and then that's why it's important to have your navy. Is not something he could have known.
Understandably, this has left a scar in the Chinese psyche, and that's why China is always trying to improve its navy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not this is to be expected. I think because this is the point I think about why China, like it seems to me that in a way that you don't really get in the West, China has never really identified, as far as I can tell, with its dynasties, and I think in part that's just because of the fact that the last very few dynasties have actually controlled all of China, especially as time has moved forwards, and the ones that have are like the Ming, Yuan, and the Qing. Yuan and the Qing were like openly oppressive, sort of
You will either
operating through.
you will either have this haircut or I will literally lop your head off.
Yeah, and like sort of and the Ming, I mean, the Ming were somewhat equally bad in that all of these groups as well, they would if some guy rebels and they smash him, and then his kids are running around being rebels for a while, then you just hire them and like get them to extort the peasants, and like that sort of mentality in China, that runs through even into sort of modern day, especially when you get into like KMT drug smuggling in the Golden Triangle. It seems to me to be that there's less of an identification with these dynasties so much as almost with China itself, in part because a lot of these dynasties have been pretty shitty compared to the sort of Confucian ideals that they're meant to be based on, or obviously the sort of Taoist religious practices that most of the population would be interested in, or Buddhist for that matter.
Yeah.
So
That is in fact represented specifically because essentially China in Chinese is called the Middle Kingdom, and that has been the case since quite a long while. I don't actually know what was the dynasty / period that enshrined that, but it's quite old, easily more than 700 years. Well, 700 years. By this point, it should be pushing 800, I guess. But in any case, the unlike say, how am I going to put this? The dynasty in China was kind of seen as a glue that held disparate regions together, but China was always its own beast. There was always the notion of China proper. There was always a notion. Well, there was for the longest time there was a notion of China proper. Then there was the notion of wider China that was largely the borders of the Qing dynasty. But that was also has to do with China, with the Qing dynasty policy of unifying all its peoples in the vague definition of Chinese, because until that point, and well, arguably now again today, the Han were an ethnic group separated and above all the others as the dominant group, with ironically enough the Qing despite being for the longest time discriminating against the Han, were the ones that tried to like compress all the different ethnicities of China into a single vague-ish notion of China-ness.
I mean, I'd
Chinese-ness.
argue that the notion of the mandate of heaven has a notion of a China beyond the dynasty built into it. The obvious parallel is with divine right in the West, where the king has divine right and then he passes it on, and then that's specific to him. But because you can lose the mandate of heaven, that suggests that the mandate of heaven applies to something greater than the person holding it, being this notion of China that is continuous throughout its history.
Again, when and as Bron said, it is in the name, quite bluntly, because when we say the Middle Kingdom, a more accurate translation, especially to what it means in English, would be something along the lines of axis mundi. Wait, that's Latin. The world's axis. It is the notion of Middle Kingdom is literally the axis upon which the heavens and earth spin, basically. So it's It's quite the thing to call your country when you fully know the entire cosmology behind it. And what Bronte says is doubly true. There is always this notion of, well, China proper, of the Middle Kingdom, etc., etc., etc. That all the other dynasties, what they did was either hold bits of it or expanded it to include more areas.
Yeah,
I mean, I'd argue that sort of the notion of China is more than just the land. It's sort of a legal concept. There's this, just like there is a legal concept of the Roman Empire.
Well, yes, it's well. I
Which
wouldn't.
which is why I'm pleased to announce the eighth Rome.
Oh God. How many Romes can there be? As many humans there are.
ANCAP Rome. Yeah, I mean, I think the
Mon says it's my turn on the Rome. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think the other interesting point to be had here is that in terms of ethnicity as well, the Qing and the various state building efforts of prior groups were very important for the expansion of Chinese of the Chinese population and of sort of Han ethnicity. Or the most obvious example would be sort of the Qing's genocide of the Dzungar. The Mongols, the Yaoan Mongols, did a prior genocide in the same region. I can't remember against who, what the ethnic group was called, but there has been a fairly continuous, sort of wiping out of populations in those regions, resettlement, moving around, and binding to the imperial center. And you see this even in things like not the Boxer Rebellion, the Protestant, the pseudo-Protestant rebellion,
The Heavenly Kingdom.
the Heavenly Kingdom. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
because that was essentially the last attempt, really, of like the Hakka and various other Cantonese Yui groups in southern China to assert some kind of regional independence, and they were defeated. And it sort of has had it itself laid the foundations for the Boxer Rebellion, which obviously then laid the foundations for the KMT revolution, or Guomindang revolution. So there has been a significant interplay between dynasty and like sort of these various ethnic groups, essentially, and the attempt to define who is in China, as it were.
Dear listener, we will also one day have a special episode on the Heavenly Kingdom. So do not worry if we are kind of touching on that subject lightly.
No promises are made on the timescale.
Absolutely none. But it will happen, as sure as the sun will rise.
It will happen unless all members die before it happens.
Spiritually, literally, or metaphysically. But back to the topic.
Or all of the above.
Indeed. Or our credit or a rating score just goes so down. We are now in the death squad zone. But back to the topic of like the Chinese evolution. I would like to go slightly back and talk about Chinese settlement policies, because we actually, due to Chinese record keeping and bamboo actually lasting quite a lot in terms of history, we actually have some good archival evidence of how China conducted its colonization experts. I can't quite remember what the dynasty was, if it was the Han or if it was one of the later ones. But it was one of the dynasties that managed to take control of the Tamarind Basin, which is now modern day Xianjing. Well, southern Xianjing, but still. The base idea is that the way they did colonization of that is they sent the troops, sent in all the troops' children, and then bankrupted the state in buying them steel tools so that the colonization could go well. Sad to say, this did actually bankrupt the state and would later sow the seeds of the rebellion that would destroy this dynasty. Not outright, but it would dealt it the death blow. So when the Chinese colonizers, they often had these very centrally laid out plans that sometimes worked too well, and sometimes failed so bad that they took the dynasty out with them. So what
Yeah.
all this to say that sometimes genocide really is the cost-effective solution.
Yeah, I mean, that's not an endorsement from the podcast of any genocides. But yeah, I mean, it is a case, quite simply, that China has historically been constituted through a series of conquests that have very often resulted in genocide, destruction of population, so on and so forth.
Population movements and mass immigrations.
Yeah.
I mean, China never.
Or as we like to call it here at Monarchism Unfiltered, Tuesday.
Yes, China had a lot of Tuesdays. It had so many Tuesdays, it's radically changed the demographic makeup of regions outside of China to this day. Just go into Indonesia or Singapore and see what happens.
Arguably, they're still having a few Tuesdays.
Yep. Can't wait for Africa in 2121. Just can't wait. Just can't wait.
Africa, didn't you Tuesday?
God. The another thing we've also kind of been like we've been touching on, like we've talked about we've only touched a single topic, which is the divine mandate. So let's quickly, well, not necessarily quickly, but let's go to the other two pillars: ritual and bureaucracy. And they are incredibly intertwined to the point that in some dynasties they can be considered one. In short, the Chinese emperor, for most Chinese emperors, spent a lot of their time being bureaucrats and doing bizarro rituals to appease the heavens. Appease is not the correct word. Honor the heavens and the ancestors, etc., is the more accurate one. And so, understandably, these rituals held a very important position, a position that's oddly similar to what some African monarchies had of if the king does not do these rituals, the world will literally collapse. Except in China, they did not have the monarch sacrificing part in case of failure. Probably they should have, but I mean, that would have certainly saved us a few tyrants of Shang. But the base idea is that ritual often devoured an incredibly important amount of time in the Chinese emperor's, well, lifetime. And this did not conduct itself properly to good bureaucratic decisions. So much so that the Chinese history can be understood as a rolling conga line of, are eunuchs good for administration? The answer is God, hell no, they are not. Then you have a massive purge, civil war, death, murder, chaos, chaos. They do this 2 more times, give or take, in which the answer is, oh God, no, eunuchs are bad at administration. What are you doing? And again, the country goes to hell. Then you have the Qing, who, what if we create mandarins, which are not eunuchs? I mean, that could not go that bad. It also went horribly bad. The Chinese dynasties were the first bureaucratic states of the modern world. They're also the first states to actually have to deal with mind-numbing high levels of corruption of which, well, Rome really is the only comparison we have today. Though perhaps that's slightly unfair to the Chinese dynasties. China did not actively require corruption in order to function. Rome did.
Utter.
China was just more prolific in its scale.
Yes.
I
We are
mean,
talk. We are talking. We are talking. So, administrator, why has this? Why has the most fertile region of the land not paid taxes? He says while he literally hides all the region's fucking grain. I don't know where, but he's hiding it. They refuse to pay. So send an army. I'll lead it. I'll lead that army and get you your money. He proceeds to violently extort the people. The people rise up in rebellion, and he then kills the rebellion. And he probably uses this to springboard into a position of influence at the court and probably build his own private army, to which he will later use to overthrow the dynasty slash fight it. This was a running team. China had a very advanced bureaucracy, had incredibly how am I going to put this nicely? Incredibly childlike notions of anti-corruption combat. Which, and when I mean childish, I mean when we got there in the 1800s, we taught the Chinese double entry booking. So yeah,
I mean, double entry bookkeeping was very innovative because it was invented in Venice in the 1300s.
Yes, in the Renaissance, they only got that technology 400 years later, even though they invented every single piece of technology required to create double entry booking. This is the level of how did you get so far and so high without having this important element to your state. And China really is showing that you do not need to be a slave society to have an absurdly big state that is primed for collapse at every single point.
But still, remember, kids, don't do slave states. Whereas we like to call them Wednesdays.
Do Tuesdays, not Wednesdays. Wait, what? um, going back to the topic. The base idea, especially with the eunuchs, is that they didn't have children. Well, weren't supposed to have children, but sometimes a person with illegitimate children got made a eunuch, which complicated things a lot, or had connections to their family, the family that spawned him, which was not ideal, but was never outright outlawed. That means that you had, well, not eunuch dynasties, you had families that did propagate and last in time that often could take advantage of the intense connections they had on the goings on of Chinese bureaucracy. So you had very weird things that happened in that they tried to create the faceless bureaucrat by creating a separate caste of people, and that backfired in more ways than one because essentially there was no actual ability to oversight. Who are you going to send to oversee the eunuchs? A non-eunuch? That's just begging for the eunuchs to revolt and kill you. Note, I think one emperor actually tried that, and they did revolt and assassinate him.
The interesting is that giving people who can't have children administrative power is not unique to China. I mean, the Autonics system from 10th century Germany comes to mind, in which he made bishops prominent vassals in the Holy Roman Empire with the notion that they couldn't pass on land to their heirs.
I mean, Georgia also did that. The Sardrosho districts, which were essentially church administrated, Georgian Orthodox Church administrative districts. So it's not that it is
It's
a
far from unique.
yeah, it's not unique, but in terms of its absurd level of corruption, it is very much a Chinese thing.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, some of the stories
Arguably, this sort of corruption can be seen to this day. If you look at the relationship between local bureaucrats and real estate developers. You know where I'm going with this, Mikulski.
I do. No way.
Yeah,
Just go.
yeah, because in China today, a local bureaucrat can make land available for development, even if people previously lived there, and a developer can come and develop it for government money, and then embezzle all the costs, make the development project as large and costly as possible, and then make hefty donations to the bureaucrat involved. And what this has resulted in are the so-called ghost cities, which is why in China today there are scale replicas of parts of Paris, London, and Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where no one lives. And in fact, there are so many empty houses in China that there are 2.3 houses for every person in China.
Epic. Homelessness time with all the houses. I mean,
What if homeless people owned multiple homes?
Yeah, I mean, why be homeless when you can have multiple decaying shitty homes? And I mean,
it's not that it's that they are not near anything, because no one lives in these cities, and so there is no infrastructure, there are no open shops, and there are, most importantly, no jobs.
Yeah, and it's sort of, yeah, I mean, you can watch videos of people driving through ghost towns, and it's quite strange. But I think yeah, because it is born from this kind of culture of corruption that does to this day still exist in China, though the Chinese government do try to combat it at various times with varying degrees of success.
Yeah, the big difference is that now they have tools beyond double entry booking.
Yeah, now you have, selling people's organs to the black market and things like that.
I mean, now you have one better than double entry, but now you have Excel. So now you can really
Stonks.
organize the corruption.
Yeah, stonks with Excel.
Probably Chinese equivalent of Excel. I don't come to think of it, because I don't know what Microsoft and China, what the relationship there is, but I'm sure there is an equivalent.
There must be. China's not dumb enough to pay for the Microsoft subscription.
Only I am.
Only you and all the states of Europe that spend literal billions on that every year.
Yeah, it's why you need to just nationalize this stuff.
Yeah, but the Google options look so ugly.
I mean, I don't know too much about that.
Why have a good state that uses effective budgeting or a pretty state that's on the verge of bankrupt at all times?
Yeah, I mean, that's the essential question. Which do you choose? Which way, Western man?
How are you going to... You have to make room for Excel in the budget, otherwise there won't be a budget. Because where are you going to have it? Not in Excel. That's ridiculous. This has quickly devolved.
Either way, to return to the topic of China, I think the important or interesting point to be had in China is this question of the degree to which China as a centralized polity has emerged largely from the state building efforts of various Chinese states, unlike, say, Yugoslavia, which was born from some kind of ethnic sort of whatever, or even like modern Germany, which sort of re-emerged almost, or say France. and to a far greater degree, it has come into existence because of the states that have formed it, and the form it has taken has very much been directed by state power, and in large part this is just because of like the amount of people in China, and largely just because of the the power of genocide and these sort of things in the
The
ethnic
all-powerful Tuesday.
Yeah, the all-powerful Tuesday.
Remember, kids, if you want to keep your state nice and orderly, never forget Tuesdays.
Nice
God.
orderly state, lots of Tuesdays, maybe a couple Wednesdays. Yeah, you can't go wrong then, really. That's just how it is.
See, this is basic state building. Why do republics fail? Because they try to whitewash Tuesdays. That's why they fail.
Embrace the Tuesday.
Oh God, we are loopy today, huh?
This is very loopy. This episode is straight up copper plate.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a
I
font joke.
epic. Yeah, so I think really basic thing is just China is interesting in terms of the way that or I think the question of why is there China but why is there not Rome is I think the very interesting question, at least from a Western perspective, and I think it has to be put down essentially to geography almost, that in certain ways the the ethnic groups that exist in like the Mongols or whoever were stronger and strong enough that they were able to conquer all of these areas, whereas the various Huns or whoever else were not, and that the very structure of European geography precluded the kind of state building that China had, as well as not having rice, not having anything like the potato, that means you have lower populations, and this makes it harder to have large-scale wars and centralized state apparatuses like in
Yeah, I
China.
mean, at least until the development of the four-field system in the 1600s, by which time it really got going. That one's much later.
Yeah, and that's because like Chinese rice, you can basically just keep going forever. That's far more effective. But yeah, I think that's sort of what I have to say about China. I'm not sure if anyone else does.
I have one last bit, and it's really to add to your bit, to your bronze. I am, and it is that China, especially the early dynasties, not so much the later ones, but it was a textbook case of hydraulic empire, and the hydraulic here really does mean water, because a lot of the dynasties of the early ones lost their mandate of heaven based upon whether or not they could provide proper disaster relief in case of floods, lost their like essentially maintaining the canals and the irrigation was a central point of these early Chinese dynasties, of the later ones also, but by that point the logic wasn't quite of a hydraulic state. And I think a comparison that's often ignored between China and anything else in the West is, well, West is a bit generous on this regard, but Mesopotamia, another screaming pants on fire example of what a hydraulic empire is, and how Mesopotamia was repeatedly the center of multiple times of these highly bureaucratic and developed civilizations. And the reason is that turns out managing dikes, irrigation, and all that requires an intense amount of state control and bureaucracy. And so, and centralization. And this, largely speaking, explains why these groups were able to take power but were at the same time merged or sublimed into or kept separate. It's a bit complicated, but why the bureaucracy stayed the same for so long.
I think a really good example of just how important this is to the development of China is that the sort of the great semi-mythical founder of the Chinese civilization is Yu the engineer, who was known for his building of dikes and other irrigation. Essentially, he's an irrigations infrastructure specialist, compared to, say, being a great conqueror or a man of God or something. He's the founding of the Chinese civilization specifically relates to the controlling of the river deltas of the northern Chinese plains.
So hydraulic empires, or more accurately, conditions that encourage a hydraulic empire, are directly related to. I mean, another good example of this is the multiple Egyptian dynasties, because the rivers often encourage a set type of state above other considerations. Rome never had that benefit.
I would actually argue that all the ancient high culture states are based around rivers.
I mean, yes, that's what the Fertile Crescent was in the Indus Valley
Yeah,
civilization.
and Indus River Valley and the Chinese and the Mesopotamians and everyone else. All of them. Every single one.
Yeah, so I think that's the. Yeah, I think I would agree with what's been said there. I think that's the advantage that they had. I don't have too much to say beyond this, so I think that's also a good place to leave off because it's been about an hour now.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
good exploration of China. So yeah,